I work with people on nonprofit mergers, crisis mitigation, conflict, and leadership during crisis. And one of the reasons I'm on this call is I've worked with a number of organizations as they transform their organization during a crisis, improve their organization because of a crisis, and work on their culture and leadership during that crisis.
Awesome. Thanks. And we are, three of us just are delighted that you're here, especially those of you that have been here a few times over the 6 weeks. We are very, very grateful for you and hope that we continue to stay in touch with you. So that being said, let's move into the content for today's session. So first of all, you'll see on your screen just a quick recap of some of the concepts, most of the concepts that we've covered over the previous 5 weeks. And I want to remind you that all of these are, so at the CAVI Consulting site, and Lisa, I'm wondering if you can put the link in the chat.
I sure will. Yep, absolutely.
How to access the resources and all the recordings that support these 8 concepts. So real quickly, we talked about the importance of defining reality, the importance of safety, predictability, and control, how to address and the importance of addressing unmet emotional needs, distinguishing between compassionate leadership and empathetic leadership. We gave you 5 tools for leveraging conflict. We talked about how to build resiliency for yourself and for your organizations. Last week, we talked about coming out into the new normal, if you will, the next normal, and reopening, and what that means. And then lastly, last week, we talked about things like the right questions and how two-way communication needs to happen, and the importance of changing you in this changing environment. So today we're going to be building on that and talking about what it takes to thrive over what we consider the next normal, which is the next 18 months. Real quickly, what we're going to be asking for you today, as we have over the past 5 weeks, are 5 simple things. The first is to respect confidentiality. If things are shared in the text box, or any of you come off mute and share something specific to your organization, we ask that we all keep that confidential and respect that. Number 2 is API. API stands for Assume Positive Intent. A great mantra, whether you're in this session or working with your folks on a day-to-day basis, assume positive intent. Number 3, adapt, not adopt, meaning we want you to pivot with the information that we have here. Even though I'm starting to hate that word pivot, we're going to ask that you do that and you take advantage of the information and you use it so it makes sense for you. Number 4 is the wisdom is in the room. We really want to hear from you both in the chat function and then later on when we do some report outs about what your thoughts are about how to best advise, support, and work with your fellow leaders in this room. And then lastly, we're going to ask you to step in and step up and take advantage of the opportunity to contribute to this conversation, both through the chat box and again, by taking yourself off mute or when we do our breakout rooms.
Okay, and I just want to call out, there was a question in the chat about what's in the recordings from these sessions. And so we mean what we say about what says here stays here. And so all that's in the recordings are the content that Danny, Christina, and I have done. Any comments from participants or questions from participants are outside of the recording or were left out of the recording. And so there's no names or anything like that in the recording. So just to, again, ground ourselves in the context of what's been happening for people who may be joining us for the first time or the second time, or so on and so forth. No surprise, the country and the world, in fact, has been going through a bit of a crisis. And the diagram you see in front of you is really called the crisis curve. We talk about different phases of the crisis curve. And what we really want to call attention to right now today is 2 things. One is that we're really going through this process that's called reconciliation and moving into reconstruction, which means we're sort of going back to the world, trying to figure out what exists from pre-COVID days, what the reality is now, and what it's going to shift to. And what we're understanding from people from various disciplines is that what we're going to be moving into will be called the next normal, not the new normal, and that our country, in fact, will probably, and perhaps a great portion of the world, but at least our country will be in a state of flux for probably the next 18 months or so. And so as we've done this series, we started out sort of early crisis. As we've been doing this series, we've tried to pivot and change what we're presenting to really be reflective of the environment. And so what you'll be hearing today is really about how to thrive in the next 18 months.
And we want to hear from you now. What do you think is going to be one of your bigger challenges in the next 18 months? If you could take a second and in the chat share what it is that's top of mind for you that you think you're going to have to make a big adjustment around over the next 18 months. And that might be something like finding the right information. So when you're in charge of leading and setting reality, what's the information that you need? Or leading through that changing environment. Maybe that's going to ask something very different of you as a leader than before. Or picking the right places to encourage innovation. Or sustaining and rebuilding your culture. Maybe there's a big shift that needs to happen. Or maybe there's pieces you want to make sure you protect because they're really important to your team members. And then also, what are the resources to really maintain that organization and your team that you're going to have to find new ways of accessing and building? Or is there something we haven't even mentioned in these conversations over the past 6 weeks? Is there something that really comes to mind for you? I'll give you a minute to put that in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Some great comments here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
From the preparing people emotionally to the granular tactical, operational, and then the long-term learning and development. Great stuff.
Mm-hmm. So we're seeing lots of different pieces coming up for across just this call, and thinking about that, when we have these many focuses, that remember that there's going to be other people who have similar ones out there. So this is also a great opportunity as a leader to be finding good partnerships with other organizations or great sounding boards along the way to help you get there. We see different pieces like completely altering the business model that you had previously in order to be more sustainable and in order to operate in this new environment. And incorporating a lot of frequent check-ins with people. How do you divide and protect that time to be able to do that emotional support and those pieces? These are all great elements, and we're going to dive a little deeper into what does that take when it looks like supporting your culture and sustaining the pieces of your culture that really matter to help people show up throughout this kind of chronic phase of crisis. And so Lisa's going to help us jump in on that one.
Sure. So before we start that, I just want to take a step back and talk about what culture is. Culture is one of those funny things. We know it when we run into it. We can feel it. We can sense it. But we have a hard time saying exactly what it is. For a long time, I sort of heard that culture is the way we do things around here. And that was a really helpful definition for me, somebody who needed to wrap their head around what it is. And since then, I've sort of shifted to my thinking to thinking about it's really the way work gets done around here. And that's why we care so much about what the culture is like at our organizations, because it's the way that things get done around here. It also determines our brand and what people see from us, whether it's purposeful or not. People know what our culture is and can tell us pretty quickly. And so when we think about strengthening our culture during recovery, this can feel a little daunting. Even pre-COVID, the fact is that something like, only a quarter of employees felt like they really had a culture in their organization that they felt like valued or cared about, or they felt was particularly productive. And so when you think about this may feel like a little bit of a lift, but the truth is people's brains map much more quickly during crisis. And so there's a real opportunity for us during this recovery period, if you will, to think about how to create an intentional culture. And so there's a few tips and a few things that people in different parts of the organization can do. And this is all slanted towards really promoting the intended culture. So thinking about what that intended culture is, whether it's a culture of caring or a culture of respect, a culture of authenticity, whatever that culture is, making sure that it starts at the leadership level. And actually, the way I think about culture is the roles of a culture and who contributes to the culture is really like an iceberg or almost a triangle. The leader's role is at the very top, and it's the most visible, but not necessarily the most significant. But it starts at the leadership role. And we talk about the way to start about this is talking and reminding people about what your organization brings to the world, how you're contributing now, what difference you're making now in the world and will in the future. And then weaving those messages around hope, trust, compassion, and stability into every single message, thinking about it as a narrative actually over time, and reiterating those 4 points to employees again and again. Here's what we're moving towards. Here's the promise that we bring to the world. Here's our promise to ourselves. Trust. Acting in a trustworthy way, demonstrating trust, demonstrating that you trust employees. Compassion, we've talked a lot about what that means over the last several weeks. And then creating stability, even when that means saying things are going to be unpredictable, that creates some sort of stability. And then, of course, walking the talk. And then as you move sort of down that triangle, if you will, to the next layer or down the iceberg, the manager's role. Managers play a huge part of developing our culture and really supporting it. There's estimates that managers are responsible for as much as 70 to 75% of the culture work. And so they're really an important part of this. And the great thing is, as we're developing new ways of working, whether it's changing our business model, how we change how we deliver our services, how our teams are constructed, our communication systems, those are all opportunities to weave your intended culture in. So if your intended culture is around trust and respect, then the way you're communicating needs to respond to that or reflect that. So that might be two-way communication, for example. But there's infinite opportunities as you're doing the work that you have to do in reconstruction anyway, to really reinforce the culture that's intended. Second of all, compassion. And you'll notice that's in every bucket. Demonstrating compassion, making sure that people know that they're seen, valued, and heard. Even if you can't fix their problems, letting them know that you care. You want to know what their problems are. You want to know what the barriers are to work. You want to know what's going on in their life. And that you really value their opinion, you value their perspective. And it doesn't mean that everybody gets a vote. It doesn't mean that everybody in the organization gets to decide how everything is, but it means that you value that input. And that's really important to people normally at work. It's a huge need we all have at work. And during this process, it's in recovery time, it's going to be even more important. And then lifting up as a manager and a leader, lifting up the examples of the intended culture you see around you. And doing it in a very purposeful way where you're explicitly saying what it is that the action that you want to call out. So I'm not going to just say that Danny's a great guy and he's our culture hero. I'm going to call out very specific things Danny did. Like last week when we were in a staff meeting, he offered everybody candy because we have a culture of caring and we want to make sure that people had a little bit of a lift during that long meeting when we're all sort of bored or whatever. And maybe that's not the best example, but it's an example of using SBI, situation, behavior, and impact to give praise and call out people's behaviors. And then as employees, every employee has the ability to influence the culture. In one way, thinking about how to demonstrate the culture and doing that in their day-to-day actions, but also demonstrating it in how they're compassionate for other people. Think about the things they can do that demonstrates that culture as they're helping other people, or how that intended culture has a part about helping other people, whether it's helping the clients or helping the colleagues or helping people in the community, but really thinking about how to bring that in as well, because compassion is going to be really critical during this process where people feel pretty unstable and unsure, and they're going to need that sense of being heard, valued, and seen in order to really have their own resiliency to get through this process.
From there, we're going to dive a little deeper into some tools that help you accomplish all of those pieces of the culture changes and the ways to make those pivots that Lisa was talking about. And the reason that some of these tools are really worth investing on getting comfortable and learning them and practicing how you use them within your culture is these tools will come in handy in the long term for any kind of change. Any kind of change management that you have to go through, whether it's you're implementing a new system or a new service or introducing a new product and you need to shift people around to make it happen. All of these things are going to be useful tools. We're going to talk about them today in the context of culture changes during crisis, but know that they're really useful in a lot of other aspects. So feel free to adapt them, take them, and use them in places where it makes sense for you and your team and your organization. So the first one is expect more than one shift. often we really hope that any kind of change is one big shift and we can call it a day. But what it actually often is a whole bunch of little shifts along the way that we're actually adjusting to. When we're looking at it right now and in this crisis, we're actually going to see a next new normal and a next new normal and a next new normal until somewhere past that 18-month mark where we actually start to establish our new normal. And it won't look just like the normal we came from before all of this happened. It'll be different, and it'll have lessons from all these different next new normals along the way. So think about, how do we break things down into different shifts that help us approach them one at a time? Because often that also helps make that change less overwhelming for people. And then buy-in is your friend. The more that you can give people a voice in each of these shifts, each of these changes, the more that they're going to feel ownership of helping to build where you're going. And that buy-in really helps, because none of us want to tear apart something we've helped to build. We want it to succeed. It's a really natural human instinct. And so the more you can create opportunities, even if you're pretty sure your idea is brilliant about how you're going to adjust, inviting other people to support it, inviting other people to take a look at it, be heard in the process, and find ways to help them incorporate or make little changes to it or readjust, that's going to help them to support it and see and understand your vision of that change and shift as well. And then transparency. Now, transparency in our communication especially is really crucial during crisis, because that's one of the things that gives people back that sense of reality, setting reality coming from the leader, and a sense of safety, control, and predictability. I have a CEO that I work with, and his company, he's been phenomenal through all of this, where we've broken it down and been addressing, all the layoff fears and things like that by telling them, hey, look, this is the way we would scale back on our financial spending. First, we'll if it gets bad enough, we'll have to cap increases at just 3% right now for this year across the board for everyone. Then what we'll have to do is reduce the 401k match for the year, and then maybe cancel it for the rest of the year. And then we'll go to this. And the ways he mapped them, the path of this is what it would take us doing before we get to laying anyone off. And what that does is that gives people a huge sense of control and safety, because they know where they stand. And that control is, I have the option to go start looking someplace else if it hits my threshold of I think it's going too far. And I know that path ahead. For most people, that keeps them engaged and feeling their ownership of their own career path. And so they stay engaged and they want to help and they want to be part of that. It also reduces all of that speculation that can be a lot worse and a lot more distracting than what the actual reality is. So that's where communicating and being transparent are really crucial tools. There's a great rule of 6 when we were talking about communication, because other piece is varying that communication. Just reporting out on an all company meeting isn't quite enough. You want to make sure you're putting some stuff in writing for your visual learners, or drawing a diagram for people if it's appropriate for what you're communicating, that maybe you're doing videos of it to put on your internal site to share with your team members. Maybe doing it in a Q&A where people get to come back and ask more questions once the information's kind of sunk in. Create those different touch points in a variety of different ways, because what you're doing is you're being more inclusive of the different ways that people learn and take in information and the way that it resonates with them, so that they're able to really adjust and feel comfortable with that information. And then expect some resistance along the way. It's a pretty natural phase for most people to have some degree of resistance when they're introduced to a change. That buy-in that we talked about earlier is going to really help to reduce resistance and how much it's in your face a lot of the times, but it's not going to completely remove it. So remember to take the time to understand the resistance and talk about it and give people a voice where you can. And it doesn't mean that somebody's not going to come around and support it. It means that they're still in this period of getting used to the new idea. Maybe they didn't have the information as early as a lot of other people, or they were thinking that the organization was going to go a totally different direction. And so that resistance is their way of processing. So think about being able to help them move forward by creating that voice or listening to them or encouraging them to partake, and give them a little time to have those feelings too. And the feelings that are going to probably come up for most of you is really having to learn to get comfortable with some ambiguity. Most of us don't love ambiguity. We like to have a nice path forward, a decision made, how we're going to be able to go into that next phase so we can check off all our boxes of what we need to do. But with this many shifts, we're going to have to get comfortable with the ambiguity and also get comfortable talking about it with people. The fact that here's what we don't know, or here's what I think might happen, but I don't have all the answers, and that's what I can gather from the information we have available. And then encourage them, we'll keep assessing that ambiguity, right? If you learn something, let me know. We'll come back together and work on it. It's really change management adapted to crisis. These are all tools that you can pull back on, and also look for the opportunity in it. Change is another word for growth. And sometimes it's easier to change some of that language and reframe it into, instead of having to pivot again, it's this new opportunity has opened up. Or instead of we have another change, we have a growth opportunity. And really mean it and drive for growth. There may be people that if you're getting trained on a program, maybe somebody else should be getting trained at the same time so that you're able to cross-train more people. More people have that opportunity to skill build during this process. Maybe you're setting them up for the next promotion, even if it's really unlikely it's going to happen in the next 18 months, but they're able to develop a skill that they didn't have before. You're also, as a leader, helping to safeguard them if your organization does come to layoffs, if they have more skills or new programs that they know how to run. So look at it as, how do I create more opportunities for people to be visible, have a part, and look for those opportunities for training and growth within it. And that goes back to what, if you were with us last week, going back to that growth mindset. Looking at unstuck, and we have to be able to look at what it is that's possible for where we could go, and not just hear our own boundaries that we set, or the story I'm telling myself kind of approach of what is it that I'm telling myself is our shortcoming, or another organization just does that really well. Look for those opportunities of, hey, that organization over there, they do it really well and we can get there. So how do we grow? What skills does it take us to get to that same caliber, deliver a resource that they have and they deliver really well, and the population we serve needs that too. So look through it for that as you're kind of examining that longer arc and building your game plan. How are we going to get people there? How are we going to make those opportunities for people to be seen, heard, and valued so that they feel more engaged and safe in it? And don't be afraid to set some goals along the way and reset what your expectations are within that. That's part of growth, is also to set, where are we going as a group together and how are we going to get there? What are the numbers we think we can realistically hit? And get people's buy-in on those expectations that you're setting in order to move forward.
Alrighty, so we wanted to lift out of these great suggestions and best practices that we're throwing at you and just pause for a minute and talk about what one of the sticking points can be for leaders like yourself that are fully committed to the mission and to your staff and basically of high integrity. And it's this notion of authenticity. So I want to propose to you a way of looking at authenticity. But before we do that, I have a question for you, a couple questions for you. The first is, how do you define authenticity for yourself? So if you could just jump into chat and just tell me, how do you define authenticity for yourself? Maybe it's just a few words you want to put in there. Maybe it's a sentence, a little story, whatever. But love to see a little bit in the chat. How do you define authenticity? I am who I am, no matter who my audience is. Speaking from the heart, being real, being yourself, without holding back, being true to yourself and not just following along with the crowd. Aligning with your values, being real and really listening, honesty, being your best self, actions showing up as my true self, actions reflecting your words. Great. Wonderful. All right. So one more question, and then I'm going to give you something to think about. The second question is, how can authenticity possibly get in the way of you being an effective leader? Is that possible? Can authenticity get in your way of being an effective leader? How might that show up? If you could just jump in the chat again and say, how might authenticity get in the way of being effective? I can seem too casual for some, too much sharing, too much vulnerability. Something is critical or in contrast with others' beliefs, need balance of vulnerability, too much focus on me, sarcasm, humor might not go exactly. Some people are not open to someone living in their truth. Excellent, excellent. So thank you for all that, not being really conscious of others, not looking at others' perspective. Excellent, excellent. So you're highlighting what we consider one of the sticking points in being an effective leader during crisis and all the time. It's this notion of struggling with authenticity. So what I want to propose to you is the idea of authenticity being balanced and contrasted with being effective. I'll say that again. I want us to pause and think about the notion of being authentic, being true, being honest, being who we are, and balancing that with being effective. So the truth is that those two things aren't necessarily the same thing, being effective and being authentic. And your job as a leader, in part, is to start having some of the hard conversations with yourself about what is truly effective, what truly needs to happen. And sometimes authenticity, being authentic and true and staying true to your own values and self, can actually get in the way of being effective. So the question really comes out to a question of your integrity, how you define your own integrity. So I work with a lot of clients, especially folks that are really clear on their identity and who they are and how they want to present themselves to the world. So the questions become, when does that not necessarily serve you? And perhaps a better way of thinking of being true to yourself is being a bit more nuanced in how you are exercising your authenticity. Sometimes, frankly, being 100% you isn't the best idea. And being right and righteous, it can be a lonely place. So think about if you're having an opportunity, oftentimes with clients right now who have to, well, it's not an opportunity, it's a corner that we're in where we have to fire or furlough or lay off somebody. So it's very possible that a leader like yourself can say, I'm not feeling like myself. This isn't who I am. This isn't what I do. That's true. That's true. But to be effective means that we may need to shift back and look at what it takes to be authentic and be effective. And you can see by this graphic here, I would make the argument that to be effective is actually slightly more important than being authentic. You can have that argument and say, no, that's not true, and that may be true for yourself. But I want you to really have the conversation with yourself and land on a place of being committed to whatever it is that you're being committed to. And again, my sense is, and what I would encourage you to do and invite you to do, is to think about what it takes to be truly effective, and then to nuance your sense of authenticity to match that. Adaptive authenticity is typically the best approach. I want you to think of it, it's like you want to dress in a lightweight, casual outfit, right? The weather yesterday was beautiful, I want to be casual, I've got my outfit picked out. And then the next day you find out that it's stormy and cold. So what do? You don't necessarily not dress according to the weather. You don't necessarily dress like you thought you were going to yesterday. Instead, you think about, well, how can I still be what I want to be? Perhaps that's comfortable, whatever it is, but to alter how I'm dressing myself. So to be adaptively authentic is where we want to invite you to be as you're learning how to navigate this incredibly onerous situation that we're in with COVID and then coming out of it.
Danny, could I jump in and give one example that came from a client of mine this morning, building off your example about layoffs? So this client works in a really large organization and has really spent a lot of time developing her staff and really is very invested in her staff's development. And she is realizing that they're probably going to have to do layoffs. And so our conversation was, what is your authentic self in that situation? And we talked about the fact that she, for the greater good, they're going to have to make some budgetary choices, which may involve laying off staff. But she talked about the way in which she does it, being authentic. And they have it's a very large organization. There's all kinds of HR rules and policies about that, about how people are laid off. So it's not even up to her about how people are laid off, but she still had some discretion. Everything from being very transparent with staff about we're going through a budgeting process. We don't know what the parameter, we don't know where we're going to wind up. There are 5 priorities we're basing our resource allocation on. She also had a conversation with her staff individually in one-to-one sessions about, when you get hard news, there's going to be shifts. Your work is going to shift. All kinds of things might happen in this situation. Nothing's going to stay the same. When there is hard news to share, how do you prefer to get it? Do you, talking about what way they want to receive information, even if it's just as something as simple and small as their job shifting. So that for that leader, that felt authentic. And she also talked about being able to emphasize to people if she has to lay them off, what their skills are, where she sees them fitting in the greater world, all kinds of things. And so she's really working to balance both of those things. And she will say she does not want to be laying people off. That is not who she is. But for the greater good, if they're going to have any kind of programming left, she's probably going to have to make some harder choices and prioritize certain things. And that's also her authentic self as a leader. She is called to lead and make hard choices.
That's
so
right.
Anyway, I just wanted to offer that because I'm sure people will struggle with that particular scenario. And I thought it was a nice example of weaving authenticity into really hard work that we're all sort of faced with.
Indeed. Yep. Yeah, so it's the notion of not letting go of your authentic self, but it's to adapt it in a way that makes sense for, as Lisa said, the greater good of the organization, however you define effective. It's a struggle for all of us. The other side of that is what we know doesn't work. So to be a bull in a china shop with my authenticity isn't necessarily in service to the china shop or the organization. And the flip side of doing everything according to Hoyle and check, without being who you are and bringing your best and true self to your work, that's not a good place either. So think of it as a Venn diagram. You can be right and authentic and all those things and be effective. And on balance, to be effective is actually what trumps being authentic and right.
Yeah, and Danny brings up one of the pieces that we may all have to be working on throughout this change, that we may need to be focusing on striking the right balance. That might be kind of the learning that is really in front of us when we're walking through all of these culture changes.